What if an entire empire could be erased so completely that only a single manuscript remembers it? Not a monument, not a ruin, not a shattered city buried beneath sand, just a book. A fragile manuscript written in 1357, thin pages browned by time, ink fading at the edges. A document that modern history quietly dismisses as a curiosity. But what if that dismissal is the point? What if the book survives not because it was harmless, but because it was overlooked? This is not the story of a lost city. This is the story of a world that vanished, and it begins with a book that should not exist. The manuscript is known as The Travels of Sir John Mandeville. According to its own account, it was written by a knight, a man who claims to have traveled across nearly the entire known world, from Europe through Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, and deep into lands medieval Europeans were never supposed to understand. Historians today call it fiction. They place it on the shelf beside bestiaries and legends, citing strange creatures, impossible distances, and implausible geography. But here is the first problem. This book is older than most of the histories that contradict it. It predates modern cartography. It predates standardized geography. It predates the version of the medieval world we are taught in school. And more importantly, it does not read like fantasy. Fantasy meanders. Fantasy exaggerates. Fantasy signals its own unreality. This manuscript does none of that. It catalogues. Distances are measured in days of travel. Borders are described in relation to rivers and mountains. Political systems are outlined with administrative detail. The tone is not mythic, it is bureaucratic. The voice is not that of a storyteller. It is the voice of someone reporting what exists. Sir John does not write as though he is impressing an audience. He writes as though his audience already knows this world. That alone should make us uneasy. Consider the medieval world we are taught to imagine. Fragmented kingdoms, limited trade, dangerous slow travel, little understanding of distant lands. Now compare that to the world inside this manuscript. A world of vast interconnected regions, empires spanning continents, caravans crossing thousands of miles, markets overflowing with goods Europe could barely imagine. This is not a small world. It is a global one, and Europe is not its center. Early in the manuscript, Sir John describes lands and phenomena modern historians dismiss as mythical. A spring near Mount Palombe, whose scent changes every hour. Cinnamon, cloves, roses, and whose waters cure illness with 3 sips. In modern history, healing springs belong to legend. But Sir John does not describe it as legend. He describes it as geography, a known location, a fixed landmark, a place travelers recognize. This is how one describes a well, not a miracle. Then there are the creatures, griffins stronger than lions, eagles large, enough to carry horses, bones used by archers to craft powerful bows. Modern readers recoil, but medieval readers would have recognized something important. Sir John does not describe these beings with awe. He describes them with practicality. Where they live, how dangerous they are, how people interact with them. This is not the language of myth, it is the language of logistics. But none of this is the manuscript's greatest contradiction. Not even close. The true fracture appears when Sir John begins describing nations, entire peoples, entire political systems, places that do not exist on modern maps, but once dominated medieval ones. He writes of a vast northern land, a land not called China, a land beside China, a land called Cath. And Cath, he insists repeatedly, is not the name of a kingdom. It is the central province of something far larger, an empire whose name appears casually throughout the manuscript as though it were common knowledge. Great Tartaria. This is where history becomes dangerous, because Tartaria is not a fantasy invented by Sir John. It appears on medieval maps, again and again, stretching across northern Eurasia like a continent-sized power. Yet today, Tartaria is treated like a mistake, a misunderstanding, a myth. How does an empire that appears consistently on maps, drawn by different scholars in different countries over centuries, simply disappear? Empires collapse. They leave ruins. They leave records. They leave scars. Tartaria leaves silence. Sir John describes serving the ruler of Cath, the great Khan, for 15 months. Not visiting, serving, fighting in his army, obeying his commands. This is not a story a medieval author invents lightly. If false, it would have been easy to disprove in his own lifetime. Yet the manuscript circulated widely, copied, preserved, read, and then, quietly, it was neutralized, reclassified as fiction, stripped of authority, shelved as a curiosity. Because if this manuscript is even partially accurate, then the medieval world was not small, it was vast, and someone edited it. That brings us to the question history never asks. If Tartaria existed, if Cath was not China, if Europe was not the center of the world in 1357, then where did that world go? And who made sure we forgot it? Because books don't survive accidentally, and neither does forgetting. If the manuscript of 1357 is telling the truth, then the medieval world we were taught to imagine is not just incomplete, it is inverted. The first episode left us with a disturbing possibility, that medieval Europe was not the center of the world, not even close. That power, wealth, and coordination existed elsewhere, on a scale that dwarfed the kingdoms of the West. Now we must confront what that world actually looked like, because the manuscript does not describe isolation. It describes integration. Modern history frames the medieval period as fractured, kingdoms separated by geography, language, and limited trade. Travel was dangerous, slow, rare. Knowledge of distant lands was vague, rumor-driven, unreliable. This assumption underpins everything we believe about progress. But when we read the 1357 manuscript carefully, that assumption collapses. The world Sir John describes is not stitched together by rumor. It is stitched together by roots. Throughout the manuscript, distances are measured not in imagination but in travel time. After 15 days by camel, 7 days across the plain, 3 days beyond the river. This is not poetic language, it is logistical language. It assumes that people move, frequently, across enormous distances, and not just explorers, merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, officials. Trade routes in the manuscript are not fragile threads, they are arteries. Caravans cross deserts routinely. Ports are crowded with ships from distant regions. Goods circulate so widely that silk, spices, leather currency, and precious metals are described not as miracles, but as standard economic features. This is not a marginal world struggling to connect. It is a system already connected. Here is where the contradiction sharpens. In the official narrative, Europe in the 14th century is barely recovering from catastrophe. The Black Death has devastated populations. The 100 Years' War drains resources. Feudal systems dominate production. Europe is inward-facing. Yet the manuscript depicts a world where Europe is simply one region among many. Not the richest, not the most powerful, not the most organized. Sir John writes of lands whose markets make European cities look provincial. He describes capitals so vast that travel within them takes days. He speaks of rulers whose authority stretches so far that their borders are not known by sight, only by rumor. And Europe is not competing with them. Europe is observing them. This is not accidental. The manuscript's worldview places power elsewhere by default. Europe does not sit at the center of the map. It sits at the edge. That alone explains why later historians were uncomfortable with it. A narrative where Europe rises slowly toward dominance requires Europe to start from ignorance, but the manuscript implies something far more threatening, that Europe rose after something else fell. Consider how medieval maps were drawn. They were not centered on accuracy, they were centered on worldview. What you place at the center reveals what you believe matters, and early maps often placed Asia, not Europe, at the center of the world. Jerusalem might be spiritually central, but political and economic gravity pulled eastward. Tartaria, Cath, and the lands beyond dominated the horizon. This aligns perfectly with the manuscript. Sir John does not describe traveling to the edge of the world. He describes traveling through it. From one functioning region to another. Borders are crossed, not discovered. Officials are encountered, not imagined. The world he describes is already known to someone, which raises a critical question. If this global integration existed in 1357, where did it go? History tells us that global integration is a modern phenomenon, that globalization begins with European exploration. But the manuscript suggests the opposite, that Europe entered an already global world, and later rewrote the story to make itself the origin. The economic evidence reinforces this. In the manuscript, wealth does not concentrate in Europe. Gold is not scarce, it is architectural. Entire palaces are described as having floors of gold. Not symbolic gold, structural gold, gold so abundant that it is removed from circulation as currency. This is not how poor societies behave, it is how resource-saturated empires behave. Even more telling is the monetary system. Sir John describes an empire where money is not metal. It is treated leather, standardized, stamped, regulated. Gold is prestige. Leather is administration. This implies something extraordinary. A centralized authority capable of standardizing currency, enforcing acceptance across vast territories, maintaining economic stability. This is not a loose confederation. It is governance. And governance implies infrastructure. Roads, way stations, supply chains, security. The manuscript assumes all of this exists. It does not explain it, because to its original audience, explanation was unnecessary. Now consider what modern history tells us. That such coordination was impossible in the medieval world, that states lacked the technology, bureaucracy, and communication. Yet here it is, described casually, not as aspiration, as reality. This is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Either A. The manuscript is a complete fabrication, yet somehow aligns with medieval maps, trade patterns, and independent accounts. Or B. The medieval world was far more complex than we allow, and that complexity was later erased. There is no third option. The idea that the manuscript exaggerates falls apart under scrutiny. Exaggeration amplifies the exotic. This manuscript normalizes it. Sir John does not marvel endlessly at scale. He records it. He does not frame Cath as miraculous. He frames it as administrative. This is especially clear in his portrayal of power. European kings are never described as peers to the Great Khan. They are smaller, local, regional. The manuscript does not insult them, it simply places them in context. And that context is humiliating to later narratives. Because if power once flowed from elsewhere, then Europe's rise is not destiny. It is succession. And succession requires a vacancy. Empires do not rise in a vacuum, they rise when something larger collapses. Which brings us back to the silence. If this global system collapsed, where are the records? Where are the wars? Where are the chronicles of conquest? Why does such a massive shift leave no clear trace? The answer may be hidden in plain sight, in how history treats the manuscript itself. By labeling it fiction, historians avoided confronting the implication that medieval Europe was not the center of the world, and if Europe was not the center, then the entire arc of progress must be re-examined. The manuscript does not describe a primitive planet awakening, it describes a post-collapse world stabilizing. Trade still flows, empires still exist, but something feels diminished. Sir John never describes building, only maintenance, never describes expansion, only administration. It is a world operating on inherited momentum. This is subtle, but it matters, because it suggests the manuscript was written after something ended, not at the beginning of something new, which leads us to the most destabilizing contradiction yet. The manuscript insists on something modern history denies outright, that Cath is not China, that the heart of power lay elsewhere, and that later historians merged them deliberately, not because they were confused, but because separation was inconvenient. That is where the next fracture lies, and it is the most dangerous one yet. There is a moment in every investigation when a single detail destabilizes everything that came before it. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is precise. This is that moment. If there is one claim in the 1357 manuscript that cannot be waved away as exaggeration, myth, or medieval ignorance, it is this: Cath is not China. Sir John does not imply this. He states it, repeatedly, without hesitation. And once we take that statement seriously, the entire structure of Eurasian history begins to shift. Modern historians tell us that Cathay was simply a European misunderstanding of China, a linguistic confusion, a shadow name applied to the same place by travelers who lacked accurate maps. It sounds reasonable, until you actually read the manuscript. Sir John does not describe Cath vaguely, he places it geographically. China lies east of Cath. Cath lies beside China. They share borders, not identity. He describes different rulers, different administrative systems, different centers of power. This is not confusion. Confusion blurs. This is differentiation. More importantly, Sir John describes serving the Great Khan, not in China, but in Cath. He is explicit about where power resides. Cath is not peripheral. It is central. It is the heart of authority. And China, while wealthy and significant, is not the seat of empire. This matters because later history collapses these distinctions. Cath becomes China. China becomes the empire. The rest fades. But medieval sources do not support that collapse. They resist it. Let us step away from the manuscript for a moment and look at medieval maps. Before the 17th century, cartographers consistently depicted Cath, or Cathay, Katy, China Tartaria as distinct regions. Cath often appears north or northwest of China, within Tartarian territory. China appears further east. Different borders, different labels, different political implications. These were not casual doodles. Maps were expensive, authoritative documents produced by scholars and institutions. They were copied from earlier sources, corrected cautiously, and rarely altered without reason. So why do later historians insist Cath and China were the same place? Because once Tartaria disappears, Cath becomes inconvenient. A capital without an empire. A center without a structure. By merging Cath into China, historians close a gap. They restore continuity. But continuity is not accuracy. It is comfort. Let us examine the logic of the confusion argument. We are told medieval travelers did not understand Asia well enough to distinguish regions, yet those same travelers tracked distances accurately, distinguished currencies, noted administrative systems, recorded borders and routes. They could differentiate deserts, rivers, mountain chains, and kingdoms, but somehow confused the political heart of a continent-sized empire with a neighboring civilization. That stretches credibility. Sir John does not write like a man guessing. He writes like a man reporting a known system. And that system places Cath at the center of something larger. That larger entity has a name. It appears casually in the manuscript without explanation, because explanation was unnecessary. Tartaria. Here is where the narrative becomes dangerous. Tartaria was not a single country in the modern sense, but medieval sources treated it as a coherent geopolitical zone, large, organized, governed, connected. It appears on maps for centuries, yet modern history treats it as a placeholder, a misunderstanding, a label for scattered tribes. But that explanation fails, because maps do not label scattered tribes as continents. The disappearance of Tartaria from history requires an explanation, and the easiest explanation is reassignment. When you remove the empire, you must redistribute its components. Cath is absorbed into China, borders are redrawn, history simplifies. Now return to the manuscript with this in mind. Sir John describes Cath as unimaginably wealthy. Gold is not currency, it is decoration. Administrative money is leather. Markets operate at enormous scale. Rulers command armies that traverse distances Europe could barely comprehend. This does not resemble any China described in European medieval records, but it perfectly resembles an imperial capital. This distinction is not unique to Sir John. Marco Polo also distinguished between regions later merged by historians. So did Arab geographers. So did Persian chroniclers. Independent traditions converge on the same structure. That convergence is not coincidence. The act of merging Cath into China solved a problem for later historians. It eliminated an orphaned capital. It erased Tartaria by implication, and it allowed history to flow neatly toward modern geopolitics. But neatness is not truth. There is another clue hidden in plain sight. Language. Place names do not vanish overnight. They linger in dialects, ethnonyms, regional terms. Tatar, Katai, Cathay. These names echo across centuries. They do not behave like errors. They behave like remnants. Now consider what this means politically. If Cath was the heart of an empire larger than China, then China was not the dominant Eastern power in the medieval world. It was a neighbor, perhaps a rival, perhaps a subordinate. That reality undermines the tidy civilizational ladder modern history presents. And it raises an uncomfortable possibility that the collapse of Tartaria reshaped Eurasia so completely that later powers inherited its territory, its trade routes, and its silence. This brings us to motive. Why would later historians collapse Cath into China? Why erase Tartaria? Why simplify the map? Because history is written backward, from the present. We project current borders onto the past. We assume today's powers were always destined to rise. Anything that contradicts that destiny becomes an anomaly. An anomaly must be removed, and removal does not always require destruction. Sometimes it only requires reinterpretation, a name reassigned, a map corrected, a manuscript reclassified. By the time modern cartography stabilized, Tartaria was gone. Cath was gone. Only China remained, and Europe stood ready to claim centrality. But the manuscript does not cooperate. It refuses to align. It preserves a snapshot of a world before simplification, a world where power was distributed differently, a world where Europe was not the inheritor of destiny, but a peripheral observer. This is why the Cath versus China distinction matters more than giants, griffins, or legends. It is structural, it is geopolitical, it is measurable. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it, and once you accept it, the next question becomes unavoidable. If Tartaria existed on maps for centuries, if its capital was Cath, if its disappearance required reassignment rather than explanation, then the maps themselves must hold the next clue, because maps do not forget accidentally, they are corrected deliberately. Maps are not decorations, they are statements. Every line drawn on a map represents a decision: what matters, what exists, what deserves a name. For most of history, maps were not tools for travelers. They were instruments of power, commissioned by rulers, scholars, and institutions to define the world as it was understood. Which is why maps remember things texts can be made to forget. And for centuries, maps remembered Tartaria. Long before modern atlases standardized borders, medieval and early Renaissance cartographers depicted the world very differently from the way we see it today. Their maps were not always accurate by modern standards, but they were internally consistent. They reflected a shared understanding passed down through older sources, traveler accounts, and imperial records. And across these maps, again and again, appears the same vast entity, Tartaria. It stretches across northern Eurasia like a continent within a continent. From the edges of Eastern Europe, across the steppes, through Central Asia, and toward the Pacific. It is not marked as wilderness. It is not left blank. It is labeled confidently, often in large lettering that dominates the page. This was not a footnote. It was the map. Importantly, these maps were created by different people in different countries over different centuries. Italian monks, French scholars, Dutch cartographers, Arab geographers, they did not collaborate. They did not copy from a single source, yet they all depicted Tartaria as a coherent region. That consistency matters. Critics often claim that Tartaria was merely a vague label for unknown lands or nomadic tribes, but the maps do not support that explanation. Unknown lands are usually left blank or filled with warnings. Tartaria is filled with structure, sub-regions, borders, capitals, rivers, trade routes. It is treated as political geography. Even more telling is how Tartaria is positioned. It is not peripheral. It is central. Europe often appears cramped at the western edge, while Tartaria occupies the largest contiguous landmass on the map. China is shown beside it, not above it. India is below it. The Islamic world borders it. This positioning reflects influence. Maps place importance at scale. Now observe what happens over time. In maps from the 13th to 16th centuries, Tartaria is vast and unmistakable. In the 17th century, something changes. The borders begin to shift. Names fragment. Tartaria becomes Great Tartary. Then Independent Tartary. Then subdivided into smaller regions. Still present, still labeled, but less unified. Then, by the late 18th and 19th centuries, Tartaria is gone. Not renamed, not redefined. Gone. The same territory is now divided among emerging states: Russia, China, Mongolia, Central Asian Khanates. But nowhere is there a footnote. No explanation, no scholarly debate, no transitional map saying, here is why this empire no longer exists. Almscan simply vanishes. This is not how cartography normally behaves. When borders change due to war, treaties, or collapse, maps record the process. They show conflict. They show transition. They show uncertainty. Tartaria's disappearance is clean, too clean. Ask yourself a simple question. If Tartaria never existed, why did so many maps include it? If it existed but collapsed, why is there no record of how or when? If it was merely misunderstood, why does the misunderstanding persist consistently across centuries and cultures? The mistake explanation fails every test. Mistakes vary. Patterns persist. There is another clue hidden in how Tartaria is labeled. Often it is not described as barbaric or primitive. It is not filled with monsters. It is named. Regions within it are named. That indicates administration. Cartographers did not invent bureaucratic divisions for fantasy lands. They copied them from sources they trusted, and those sources were not folklore. They were imperial records. Now consider the implications. If Tartaria existed as a dominant geopolitical zone, then its collapse would have reshaped Eurasia completely. Borders would be redrawn, trade routes reassigned, histories rewritten. New powers would emerge from the vacuum. And the fastest way to legitimize those new powers would be to erase the predecessor. This is not unprecedented. Rome erased Carthage. Dynasties in China burned the records of rivals. Colonial powers rewrote indigenous histories. But in all those cases, traces remain. Ruins, chronicles, oral memory. Tartaria leaves almost none, which suggests something different. Not conquest, not assimilation, but erasure. One might argue that Tartaria was simply too large to govern as a single empire, that it was a loose cultural zone rather than a political one. But that does not explain why it disappears entirely. Cultural zones persist, they evolve, they fragment, they do not evaporate. The only process that removes a name, this completely, is reclassification. When history decides a category no longer exists. When scholars agree, silently, that a term is obsolete, and stop using it. This process is subtle. No decree is issued, no announcement made. Textbooks are updated, maps are redrawn, older sources are labeled inaccurate, students are taught the correction. Within a few generations, the old name becomes myth. This is how Tartaria died, not in fire, but in footnotes. And yet, the maps betray the story. Because they exist, because they agree, because they refuse to disappear. Here is the final, uncomfortable realization of this episode. If Tartaria was erased from maps, then maps are not neutral records, they are curated artifacts. And if maps can be curated, so can timelines, so can civilizations, so can memory itself. Which brings us to the next fracture. Because maps tell us where something was, but they do not tell us what it was. To understand why Tartaria mattered enough to erase, we must look at what the manuscript describes living within its borders, not just cities, not just wealth, but life itself. Because if Tartaria fell, it did not only erase an empire, it erased a world. There is a reason historians are comfortable discussing maps, borders, and empires, but become uneasy when the conversation turns to creatures. Empires can be redrawn, borders can be reinterpreted, but biology feels final. If a creature never existed, then the people who described it must have been wrong, or lying, or imagining. That assumption has protected modern history from uncomfortable questions. But it may also be blinding us, Because the manuscript of 1357 does something unusual. It does not treat strange beings as myth. It treats them as neighbours. Sir John Mandeville does not describe monsters with fear or reverence. He does not invoke divine punishment. He does not frame them symbolically. He records them the same way he records mountains, rivers, and markets, as part of the environment. That detail changes everything. Let us be clear about what this episode is not claiming. We are not claiming medieval travelers witnessed fantasy creatures in the modern sense. We are not claiming giants roamed the earth in recent history. We are not rejecting biology. What we are questioning is how confidently modern history dismisses consistent descriptions across cultures without examining what those descriptions might represent. The manuscript describes griffins, not as symbols, but as dangerous animals inhabiting specific regions. Sir John gives them weight, strength, habitat, and economic relevance. Their bones are used to make bows. Their feathers and claws have practical value. This is not mythic language. This is resource language. Across Eurasia, cultures separated by thousands of miles independently depict griffins. Greek art, Persian reliefs, Scythian carvings, Chinese symbolism, different names, same form, lion body, eagle head, massive wings. Why? The easy answer is myth diffusion. But diffusion does not explain anatomical consistency. It does not explain repeated emphasis on strength, predation, and danger. It does not explain why these beings are consistently treated as animals, not gods. One plausible explanation is misclassification. Ancient observers encountering large, unfamiliar megafauna would describe them using the closest analogues available. A massive predatory bird, a powerful quadruped, combined in description. Not as fantasy, but as approximation. We know megafauna existed. We know many species vanished abruptly. We know extinction events reshape ecosystems rapidly. The manuscript may be preserving biological memory, not zoological precision. The same logic applies to giants. Sir John describes beings ranging from 30 to 50 feet tall. Modern readers recoil, but notice how he writes. He does not claim to have seen the largest giants himself. He says he avoided their territories. He distinguishes rumor from experience. This restraint matters. Fabricators exaggerate. Witnesses qualify. Giant traditions appear globally. Norse Jotnar, Biblical Nephilim, Greek Titans, Native American stories, Pacific Island legends. Again, the consistency is not in detail, but in scale. Something large, something dangerous, something remembered. Modern archaeology occasionally uncovers oversized bones. They are classified quickly: mammoth, mastodon, misidentified, perhaps correctly, perhaps conveniently, but the speed of dismissal reveals discomfort. Then there are the horned people, described not as demons, but as human variants, unable to speak, communicating in sounds, living in harsh environments. This reads less like fantasy and more like ethnographic misunderstanding. A group with different language structures, different physiology, possibly a marginalized or isolated population. Modern anthropology tells us humanity once coexisted with multiple hominin species: Neanderthals, Denisovans, others. Some vanished, some interbred. The timeline is debated, but extinction is not. The manuscript may be capturing the tail end of that process. Not gods, not monsters, but other branches. Here is the key point. The manuscript does not isolate these beings. It integrates them. They exist within a world governed by laws. They affect travel. They influence trade. They shape borders. This implies stability, not myth. Now consider what happens when civilizations collapse. Knowledge disappears, ecosystems destabilize, species vanish, memory fragments. Survivors reinterpret what they can no longer explain. Over time, biology becomes mythology. If Tartaria collapsed catastrophically, it may have erased more than cities. It may have erased contexts. Without context, truth becomes legend. This is where modern history makes a mistake. It treats myth as evidence of imagination. But myth is often evidence of compression. Complex realities simplified across generations. The manuscript may be a compression artifact, a snapshot taken just before knowledge collapsed fully into story. Notice something else. After Tartaria disappears from maps, these creatures disappear from records. Later, medieval texts become cautious. Renaissance scholars become skeptical. The world narrows. This narrowing coincides with the disappearance of Tartaria, with the collapse of the global system described in the manuscript, with the redrawing of maps, with the reclassification of history. That timing is not random. But here is the most important observation. Sir John never claims these creatures define his world. They are peripheral. They exist at the edges, just like Tartaria, which suggests that when the empire fell, the world did not end. It contracted. It simplified. It forgot. Modern civilization may not be smarter. It may simply be more selective. We kept what was useful. We discarded what did not fit. And in doing so, we may have lost a broader understanding of life itself. This episode is not about proving giants or griffins existed. It is about recognizing a pattern. When an entire civilization is erased, everything associated with it becomes suspect. Maps, languages, economies, biology. History does not erase selectively, it erases wholesale. Which leads us to the most unsettling realization yet. If Tartaria disappeared without war records, if its maps were corrected without explanation, if its biology became mythology, then the collapse was not ordinary. It was total. Total collapse leaves silence. And silence is what we must examine next. Because the loudest clue in this entire investigation is not what is written. It is what is missing. Empires do not disappear quietly. They collapse with noise, wars, treaties, rebellions, migrations, chronicles written by victors and victims alike. Even when history is biased, even when records are incomplete, collapse leaves a trail. Names change, borders shift, cities burn, survivors remember. That is why the disappearance of Tartaria is so disturbing. There is no record of its fall, no final war, no decisive battle, no conquered capital, no treaty dividing its lands, no chronicler describing its end, just silence. And silence in history is never neutral. Consider what we would expect to find if Tartaria were merely a loose collection of tribes that gradually dissolved. We would see references to conflicts between neighboring powers. We would see descriptions of migration. We would see administrative records slowly fragmenting. We would see the name fade unevenly across regions. But that is not what happens. Instead, Tartaria remains stable on maps for centuries. And then it vanishes, abruptly, uniformly, without explanation. This pattern does not match decline. It matches removal. History gives us many examples of erased civilizations. Carthage was razed, yet Rome wrote endlessly about it. The Maya collapsed, yet ruins remain and chronicles survive. The Khmer Empire fell, yet Angkor still stands. Collapse is loud, Erasure is quiet. So what kind of event leaves no narrative behind? Only two possibilities exist. Either no one survived to tell the story, or those who survived were prevented from doing so. Let us examine the first possibility. If Tartaria fell due to a catastrophic event, natural or otherwise, then the destruction must have been immense. So immense that cities were obliterated, archives destroyed, administrative centers wiped out, population reduced beyond recovery. In such a scenario, survivors would be scattered, displaced, traumatized, and lacking the institutional capacity to preserve memory. History would fracture. But even in this case, neighboring civilizations would notice. They would record the disaster. They would describe refugees. They would mention sudden power vacuums. And yet, nothing. Which brings us to the second possibility, that survivors existed, but their voices did not carry forward, because something intervened. Silence can be imposed, not instantly, not everywhere at once, but systematically, through control of archives, standardization of education, redrawing of maps, reclassification of sources, dismissal of inconvenient texts. This process does not require a single authority. It requires alignment. Alignment often follows catastrophe. After upheaval, new powers emerge. They inherit territory. They inherit resources. They inherit the right to tell the story. And the fastest way to stabilize a fractured world is to simplify the past. This is where the concept of the eraser becomes unavoidable, not as a conspiracy, but as a mechanism. When a civilization collapses so completely that its structures cannot be integrated, it becomes easier to pretend it never existed, especially if acknowledging it would destabilize new authority. Ask yourself, if Tartaria truly dominated Eurasia, then every emerging power after its fall would face a legitimacy problem. Why should we rule when something greater came before us? Why should our borders be respected when older ones existed? Why should our worldview prevail when others shaped the world first? The easiest solution is to remove the predecessor from memory. This does not require burning every book, only the important ones. The rest can be dismissed as fiction, like Mandeville. Notice how the manuscript is treated. Not banned, not destroyed, neutralized, reclassified, placed in the category of medieval imagination. This is a sophisticated erasure. It avoids attention. Now consider the timing. The disappearance of Tartaria from maps accelerates during the early modern period, the same period when printing becomes standardized, education systems formalize, nation-states consolidate, chronology is reorganized. This is when history becomes professionalized, and professionalization always narrows acceptable narratives. The medieval world tolerated contradiction. The modern world does not. This is why Tartaria could exist in medieval understanding but not in modern textbooks. It did not fit the new story. Now let us confront the hardest question. If Tartaria collapsed catastrophically, what kind of catastrophe could erase an empire spanning continents? War alone is insufficient. No known war destroys ecosystems, populations, and memory simultaneously. Plague alone is insufficient. Plagues kill people, not maps. Climate change alone is insufficient. It reshapes borders, not narratives. The evidence suggests a compound event, a large-scale collapse followed by narrative control, destruction followed by reorganization, loss followed by reinterpretation. This would explain everything we have seen. Why Tartaria vanishes cleanly, why Cath is absorbed into China, why medieval maps are reclassified as inaccurate, why strange biology becomes myth, why manuscripts are dismissed rather than debated, but there is still a missing piece. If Tartaria collapsed catastrophically, where are the ruins? This question haunts the entire theory, because empires leave stone behind, yet Tartaria does not, at least not in obvious form, unless the ruins are not recognized as such, unless they are buried, unless they were dismantled and reused, unless they were reinterpreted as natural features. Many regions once labeled Tartaria are covered in earthworks. Strange mounds, buried foundations, cities that appear partially submerged, structures whose lower levels lie underground, features often explained as gradual sedimentation, or dismissed as coincidence. But if a massive flood, mud event, or geological upheaval occurred, those explanations become less certain. We are not claiming this happened. We are observing that the silence demands explanation, because silence is not absence, it is a signal. The silence surrounding Tartaria's fall is too complete to be accidental, too consistent to be natural, too convenient to be ignored. History screams when empires fall. Tartaria did not scream. It was muted, which means someone controlled the volume. That realization leads to the most dangerous part of this investigation. Not what happened, but who decided how it would be remembered. Because once history becomes curated, the past becomes a tool, and tools are used for power. This brings us to the final mechanism, the eraser itself. Not as a villain, but as a system. History is not erased in fire. That is the first illusion we must abandon. Burning libraries is dramatic, but inefficient. It draws attention. It creates martyrs. It leaves scars that later generations investigate. True erasure is quieter. True erasure looks like correction. If Tartaria vanished, it did not vanish because someone destroyed every record. That would be impossible. Too many copies, too many languages, too many places. Instead, Tartaria vanished because history changed its rules, the way knowledge was sorted, the way credibility was assigned, the way truth was defined. This is the eraser, not a person, not a conspiracy, a process. To understand it, we must understand how history is actually written, not in theory, in practice. Before the modern era, history was plural. Different regions kept different chronicles. Contradictions were tolerated. Myths and facts coexisted. Travelers' accounts were valued even when strange. Medieval scholars did not require absolute consistency. They expected the world to be complex. Then something changed. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, knowledge was reorganized. Printing standardized text. Universities standardized curricula. Chronology was unified. Cartography was rationalized. Science demanded repeatability. This brought enormous benefits. But it also introduced a new danger. Anything that did not fit the standardized framework became an error, and errors must be corrected. This is how the eraser works, not by destroying information, but by downgrading it. A manuscript becomes fiction. A map becomes inaccurate. A chronicler becomes unreliable. A name becomes obsolete. Once downgraded, the information survives physically, but loses authority. It becomes harmless. This is exactly what happened to Tartaria. Early maps were not destroyed. They were reclassified. Outdated. Symbolic. Pre-scientific. Their authority dissolved. Manuscripts like Mandeville's were not banned. They were reframed. Travel fantasy. Medieval imagination. Literary curiosity. Once framed that way, No further investigation was required. This is erasure by categorization. The information remains, but it no longer counts. Now consider who benefits from this, not individuals. Systems. After a major collapse, new powers inherit territory. They need stability. Stability requires legitimacy. Legitimacy requires continuity. And continuity requires a past that leads naturally to the present. Anything that interrupts that arc must be removed. Tartaria interrupts the arc. A massive centralized power dominating Eurasia contradicts the story of gradual European rise. A global medieval system undermines the narrative of modern globalization. A collapsed empire raises questions about cyclical civilization, questions that destabilize authority, so the eraser smooths the timeline. Gaps are filled, names are merged, borders are redrawn retroactively. History becomes linear, safe. Let us examine one of the most powerful tools of the eraser: chronology. Time itself can be edited by selecting which calendars matter, which dates are foundational, which eras are emphasized, which are compressed. Medieval Europe used multiple dating systems, from creation, from the reign of kings, from religious cycles. Modern history standardized time. This seems harmless, but standardization always selects winners. When timelines are unified, inconsistencies disappear. So do inconvenient eras. So do civilizations that don't align neatly. The eraser does not deny Tartaria. It dissolves it into tribes, into regions, into confusion. Once dissolved, it cannot be addressed directly. Now consider education. What is taught becomes truth. What is omitted becomes unthinkable. Generations grow up never encountering the name Tartaria, not because it was disproven, but because it was never introduced. This is the most effective form of erasure. The one where no one feels censored, but the eraser leaves fingerprints, and those fingerprints are contradictions. Why do medieval maps show something modern ones do not? Why do manuscripts describe a world later deemed impossible? Why do names vanish without explanation? Why do corrections lack documentation? Because the eraser prioritizes coherence over completeness. It does not answer questions, it removes them. Now comes the most uncomfortable realization. The eraser is not ancient. It is ongoing. History is constantly edited. Borders shift. Narratives change. Textbooks are revised. New frameworks replace old ones. And each revision feels justified, necessary, neutral, which means Tartaria may not be unique. It may be an example of what happens when a civilization collapses so completely that its memory becomes inconvenient. An example of how the past is reshaped to stabilize the present. An example of how absence becomes invisible. At this point, we must pause and ask a question that feels dangerous to ask. Not about Tartaria, about ourselves. If the past we inherit is curated, if history is a product of selection, then how much of what we know exists because it survived scrutiny, and how much exists because it survived usefulness? Truth does not always survive. Utility does. This is why the eraser is not evil. It is efficient. It reduces complexity. It preserves order. It prevents destabilizing questions. But it also limits imagination, limits humility, limits our understanding of what civilization can become. If Tartaria existed and fell, then our world is not the first, and it will not be the last. That realization terrifies systems built on permanence. So the eraser keeps us focused forward, not backward, which brings us to the final episode, the one question the eraser cannot answer. If an empire as vast as Tartaria could vanish, if its memory could be dissolved, if its world could be reduced to myth, then what did humanity lose when it fell? Not territory, not wealth, but possibility. Because every civilization carries ideas, technologies, worldviews, paths not taken. When a civilization disappears, the future narrows, and if Tartaria was erased, then something was taken from us, something we never knew we lost. There is a moment in every investigation when the question changes. Not what happened, but what it meant. Up until now, we have followed fragments, maps that no longer align, manuscripts that describe a world too large to remember, empires that vanish without ruins, and a historical process that edits the past instead of burning it. But none of that answers the most important question. Not who erased Tartaria, but why it mattered that it was erased. Because civilizations are not just land armies or borders. They are ideas. And when a civilization disappears, the greatest loss is not what it built. It is what it believed. If Tartaria existed, not as myth, not as confusion, but as a functioning world-scale civilization, then it carried assumptions about reality that we never inherited. Assumptions about power, about nature, about humanity's place in the world, and those assumptions died with it. Modern history teaches us that progress is linear, that civilization advances slowly, step by step, that the past was smaller, simpler, less capable, that we are the culmination. This belief is comforting. It makes collapse feel impossible. But Tartaria breaks that comfort, because Tartaria suggests something else entirely, that civilizations can reach heights we do not remember, that they can organize continents, that they can fall completely, and that after they fall, the survivors may not understand what was lost. This reframes humanity not as climbers on a mountain, but as wanderers among ruins. Consider what is missing from our world. Not technologies. Those can be reinvented, but orientations. We no longer build for permanence. We build for efficiency. We no longer think in centuries. We think in quarters. We no longer design civilizations to outlast us. We design them to serve us. The ruins described in medieval accounts, the colossal halls, the impossible scale, were not built for comfort. They were built for endurance. They assumed continuity beyond individual lives, beyond rulers, beyond generations. That worldview is gone. And it did not disappear naturally. It vanished at the same time Tartaria did. Now consider human psychology. We are restless. We are anxious. We are obsessed with growth. We fear stagnation more than collapse. Why? Because we live inside a civilization that does not remember what comes after collapse. If Tartaria fell and was erased, then humanity lost a crucial memory. That advanced civilizations are not permanent. That dominance is temporary. That collapse is not the end, but neither is it painless. Without that memory, we repeat patterns blindly. We build faster instead of wiser. We expand instead of stabilize. We confuse innovation with resilience. This is not accidental. A civilization that remembers collapse behaves differently. It prioritizes balance, redundancy, longevity, humility. A civilization that forgets collapse behaves exactly like ours. This brings us to the most uncomfortable possibility of all. Not that Tartaria was erased, but that it was erased to reset humanity's trajectory. Imagine a world after a global catastrophe. Survivors scattered, infrastructure damaged, knowledge fragmented. Now imagine a choice. You can preserve memory of the fallen world, its mistakes, its scale, its failures, or you can simplify the story, create a clean beginning, a manageable past, a future free from the burden of remembering how high things once rose and how hard they fell. Which option creates stability? History suggests the second. If humanity remembered that a civilization larger than ours collapsed completely, every empire would rule with fear. Every leader would face existential doubt. Every system would be questioned. But if humanity believes it is the first to reach this level, then collapse feels impossible, and control becomes easier. This does not require villains, only incentives. Now consider something else we lost. Not memory, but scale of imagination. Medieval maps dared to show entire continents unified. Modern maps fragment everything into nations, borders, jurisdictions. Our imagination shrank. We no longer think in terms of planetary civilization. We think in terms of competing states, markets, blocks. Tartaria, if it existed, represents a forgotten model, not perfect, not utopian, but integrated. Its erasure trained humanity to think small, to distrust largeness unless it emerges gradually, to fear unified systems, to associate scale with tyranny rather than coordination. That alone reshapes the future. But perhaps the most profound loss is this. We lost the idea that civilization is cyclical. Ancient myths all worn of ages, rising, falling, renewal. But modern history denies cycles. It teaches inevitability, and inevitability breeds recklessness. If Tartaria fell in a way that demanded erasure, not just forgetting but restructuring history itself, then its collapse was likely catastrophic enough to terrify survivors. Not because it ended, but because it showed what happens when systems fail. That fear shaped the narrative that followed, a narrative where the past is primitive, where collapse is unlikely, where progress is guaranteed, and that narrative has guided us ever since. Now we arrive at the final question, not about Tartaria, but about now. If our civilization were to fall, what would remain? Would future generations understand what we built? Would they know why skyscrapers existed? Why satellites orbited the planet? Why data flowed invisibly through the air? Or would they adapt to the remains, using them without understanding, ritualizing fragments, turning systems into myths? Would our world become someone else's Tartaria? And would history once again be rewritten to make the survivors feel safe? This is why the Tartaria question matters. Not because it proves a hidden empire, but because it reveals a pattern. Civilizations rise, they collapse, and then history decides what the survivors are allowed to remember. The manuscript from 1357 is not dangerous because it tells a secret. It is dangerous because it reminds us that history is fragile, and that forgetting is often intentional. If Tartaria was erased, then it is not gone. It is warning us that no level of advancement guarantees survival, that no empire is immune to collapse, that no narrative is permanent, and perhaps that is what was taken from us. Not a map, not a name, but humility. The humility to understand that we are not the pinnacle, that we are part of a cycle, that the ruins we study may one day include our own cities. If this realization feels unsettling, it should, because it restores something essential: perspective. The past is not smaller than us, it is deeper, and Tartaria, whether remembered fully or only in fragments, stands as a reminder of a truth history prefers to soften. Civilization is not a straight line forward, it is a rhythm, and forgetting the last beat does not stop the next fall. This series does not end with answers, it ends with awareness, because once you see the eraser, you start noticing the empty spaces, the silences, the questions that were never asked. And once you start asking them, history stops being a story and becomes an investigation.